Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this second sprint series brought to you by Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia and the World Benchmarking Alliance. My name is Andrew Petersen, and I'm the CEO of the BCSD Australia, and very excited to have our colleagues from WBA here today as well. In the opening, as we always do, let us welcome those. Let me first tell you that I'm joining you from the land of the Camaragal people and acknowledge the traditional elders of the land upon which I am coming to you from, and all of those who are joining us today, particularly from lands right across Australia. And in doing so, paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and particularly welcome any First Nations participants who are joining us today. Okay, let's get on with it. So this morning, depending on where you are, we're focusing on corporate performance and accountability, one of our key pillars in BCSD Australia, and in particular, the mechanics of how companies translate commitments into credible transition plans and transparent reporting, which has become a bit of an issue du jour in the last couple of years, not just here in Australia, but everywhere. Now, the World Benchmarking Alliance's benchmarks are showing how the world's 2,000 most influential companies are stacking up on issues from climate to human rights. And ahead of their 2026 updates, we're going to be hearing about what's changing and why it actually matters for Australian businesses that are facing this new profile, this new lens of ISSB aligned disclosure requirements. So in this webinar, I'm delighted to welcome Nikki Gwilliam-Beeharee, who is the WBA's Head of Stakeholder Engagement, and Kendra Simmons, who is the Corporate Engagement Manager for WBA. They're going to, over the next 15-20 minutes, share some important global insights on how corporate accountability benchmarks are informing investors and as well as policymakers. And interestingly, Australia's in there. So that'll be very interesting to hear. And therefore, what are the lessons that you as business people can take out of that for operations in Australia? So Nikki and Kendra, a big thank you for joining us all the way from the other side of the world. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And yes, good afternoon, evening to everyone there. For me, it's early morning, so I'm based in the UK. Nikki Gwilliam-Beeharee, and I lead the stakeholder engagement work at the WBA. So I'm very much looking forward to taking you through a few slides and having maybe a bit of a Q&A at the end if there are any questions. So looking forward to this. So let me just start. I'm going to share my screen so you have some, as Andrew was saying, some very colourful slides to accompany this next 15 minutes. So I'm going to kick us off. And Andrew mentioned that the World Benchmarking Alliance has a focus on 2,000 companies. And those of you working in business or in finance may kind of automatically be thinking, oh, maybe that's linked to some index or, MSCI World or some other kind of way of categorizing which 2,000 companies to focus on. We have a slightly different way of identifying those 2,000 companies, and it really is the ones that we think have the biggest influence and impact on the world, and therefore it's worth spending time and effort, both from our perspective, but from anyone else that's working within those companies, or the investors that we work closely with, or the policymakers. They can really see how to drive change and system change by focusing on 2,000. And that's because those 2,000 companies, although there are thousands and thousands more companies operating in the world today, they actually represent, for instance, over 54% of global energy-related emissions. They directly employ millions of people, but obviously they also have huge supply chains. And so we really think that where they are operating, and that's across almost every country in the world, they could, if they set the right standard, if they push forward, if they take the lead it can have this catalytic effect and a disproportionate impact on the whole business ecosystem. So it's 2,000 companies for a reason. At WBA, we therefore take that 2,000 companies and we think that that's where we could see more action. And we know that, and Kendra's going to go a little bit into more in the Australian context, but we know that right now that things are looking precarious. There is a need for action, and we believe that there's no pathway to a stable or sustainable future without business transformation. Now, alongside this, of course, and Kendra's also going to mention that, and maybe I can come back in later, it's not just about sustainability of people and planet. We also think that there are business risks and opportunities. And of course, if you're working within a business, that's an important factor and something really key to be considering in your role or when you're talking to the board or any other of your stakeholders. So 2,000 companies, what we're actually doing is assessing them and benchmarking them. So I'll come back to what that means in terms of a benchmark, but that's our kind of core business at the WBA. Key thing to say, because you may be very familiar with our work, but you may also be familiar with other kind of ESG providers or commercial providers, I want to emphasize that we're a not-for-profit organization. And all of these assessments are freely, publicly available on the website. So they're all there ready to help companies, to help investors, to help regulators use these as a tool. So we very much encourage anyone to use the slides that we're going to share, but also to go on the website and dig a bit deeper. So one key final point to say of what we're doing and corporate accountability and how we work is that we're a relatively small NGO. We have around 100 people in our organization, but we are amplified, and the key part of our work is to work through others. So that's very much what we're doing here today with BCSDA, so with the Business Council for Australia. We're working through allies, and our alliance is ever growing and is very much a global footprint, again, of investors, of civil society organizations, and many other types of entity that we can really amplify and work through, who you may all be working through as key stakeholders as well. So just briefly to get a bit more into the nitty-gritty, I won't go into every single benchmark, but so that you get a bit more of an idea of what this is and how it might be useful for you. 2,000 companies, we are then looking at this from a system level. So system level meaning that aside from the sector that a company might be in, we're also looking from a particular topic. So social topics at the heart are assessed for all 2,000 companies. We're also now assessing all 2,000 companies on their climate transition plan. And then depending on the type of activity of a company, they'll be assessed, say, on urban or food and agriculture, digital or nature. We're also assessing the financial system itself. So 400 of the world's largest financial institutions, and that's really the range of banks, investors, insurers, are also part of the benchmarking process. Our benchmark is not something that companies choose to do. We've identified that 2,000 as influential, and therefore we then contact but make sure that we have as much interaction as we can with companies that we are assessing. But ultimately, as I say, it's not a kind of paid for service or an on-demand service. It's one where we're then assessing all the publicly available information and giving companies the opportunity to interact, respond, and then see the final result and use this as a tool, hopefully, for within your company. So just the final, I think, on my side, then I'll hand over to Kendra to get more into the focus on Australia. But I think the main thing to say at this point to wrap us up in the intro is that for us, it's not about just providing data. We're not just producing a nice report that's going to sit on a shelf or in a nice website page. Our core mission and the role that we're playing within our ecosystem is to think about corporate accountability. And that's not just a word that we use lightly. We've done a lot of work over the last few years to think about what does corporate accountability really mean? And more importantly, from my point of view, is how could we close that corporate accountability gap? And again, that's from a sustainability, people and planet perspective, but also we believe from a risk and opportunity perspective for business. And so just to briefly show what's on the screen here, we've done a lot of work over the last few years to think beyond the kind of company focus, 2000 companies, but more from a bigger picture of if we were to have the global agendas. So if I take, say, the biodiversity agreement, the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity agreement a few years would be an example of a global agenda setting where corporate accountability was articulated. In Target 15, there is a clear reference to what companies and investors should be doing, linking to biodiversity. That would be one key step to closing the corporate accountability gap. And then we have a whole, it might not always be circular, we might have parts at different time, but a whole process where with a global agenda in place, like that biodiversity one, you're then shifting expectations. Andrew, you mentioned, say, ISSB. That's a key standard or framework, but others would be, say, the TNFD or all the other acronyms that we're all very familiar with working in this space. Those are the key frameworks and standards. But then our role comes in when we're particularly looking at using that, using those frameworks, using those standards, not creating a new methodology if it does already exist. We do the assessments, the benchmarking, the research, and then we really want to engage with key actors that we think can influence those companies. So the companies themselves, as I say, the investors, policymakers that can change and close that gap and get more action, ultimately for companies to transform. So that's the process behind, and that's what was the focus of the webinar, was more on the corporate accountability process. So I'm going to pass over to Kendra, who's going to go through a little bit of what that means in Australia, and then we'll, as I say, have a bit of time for some Q&A at the end. Kendra, I'll move on to the next slide for you.
Thank you very much. And kia ora, everybody. My name's Kendra Simmons. I'm the Company Engagement Manager at WBA. Previously, I worked at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, so I have been familiar with your work for some time. I'm based in Amsterdam, but I am your neighbour. I'm from New Zealand. So yeah, pleasure to be here today. Thanks very much, Nikki. I will now take you through what we're doing in the context of Australia and where we see the key gaps and opportunities. In the current global geopolitical context, we see real opportunity for Australia to position itself as a global leader in sustainability best practice and have been making strides to strengthen our presence in Australia throughout this year. This included the establishment of our Australia WBA hub and also establishing our Australian-based team to support more targeted engagement efforts. Our hub is first focusing on our nature and food and agriculture benchmarks, with the aim to improve company performance, leading to real-world improvements in these topics. In addition to direct engagement with the 32 Australian headquartered companies we assess, we also work closely with our 16 allies and partners based in Australia. And I know Nikki touched on this before, but of course this includes BCSDA, it's a tongue twister, but we also work with allies such as Climate Works, B-Team, the World Wildlife Fund, PRI, and Macquarie Asset Manager. So together with our allies, we focus on peer learnings and events on key topics such as transition plans, national policy submissions, and collective impact coalitions. Most recently, this included our ethical AI CAC, which actually won a PRI award this year, which is very exciting. Next slide, please, Nikki. Brilliant, thank you. So we know that Australian companies are moving in the right direction, but to lead globally, we still need to accelerate progress. So on the slide, you can see that both our nature and food and ag benchmarks, which are our two focus areas for Australia, performance exceeds the global average. This is, of course, encouraging, but overall scores still remain low, and there are major gaps that need to be addressed. Doing a bit of a deep dive into each benchmark. On our food and agriculture benchmark, we have seen some companies significantly improve their scores, most prominently seeing one company moving in global rank from number 31 to 14th place, which is very positive. Australian companies have performed particularly well on soil health, prioritising health and regenerative agriculture, but focus is needed on closing farmers' living income gaps. We only had one company scoring above 0. And then on our nature benchmark, we see a large variation in company performance across all companies. But in terms of strengths, we see some early movers emerging related to voluntary disclosure of nature impacts, with 27% partially disclosing the impact versus the global average of 3%. Regarding environmental rights, however, no Australian companies have disclosed commitment to respect the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We are launching our new company benchmarks and assessments next January. I'll share this in more detail shortly, but this will provide an updated snapshot into how Australian companies are progressing and whether these gaps do still remain. Next slide, please, Nikki. Of course, we know progress is not being made fast enough. 2024 was the hottest year on record, surpassing the previous year. We continue to see devastating climate-related events and biodiversity loss in all corners of the world. Australia's National Climate Risk Assessment, which of course was published in September this year, warns that climate hazards will intensify and compound, threatening infrastructure, supply chains, and communities. By 2050, this report shows that over 1.5 million Australians face high risk from sea level rise and flooding. For business, the cost of inaction is already mounting, with modelling showing significant economic losses related to productivity, infrastructure, and insurance if warming continues unchecked. We know that companies need to move faster, and we need measurable progress to avoid these accelerating risks. Next slide, please, Nikki. Of course, we can't be negative. It's not all doom and gloom. With decisive actions from companies, we know we can still curb the worst impacts. These are some 4 opportunities that we've identified, but of course, there's many more opportunities for Australian companies. But focusing on these 4, number 1, use benchmarking as a catalyst for progress. Leverage WBA and other benchmarks to identify gaps, track improvement, and prioritize action in line with international best practice. Focus on the hard facts to combat misinformation and geopolitical headwinds to get buy-in from company decision makers. Number 2, move beyond compliance requirements in Australia. Adopt mandatory and voluntary global frameworks and disclosure tools like TNFD, ISSB, etc., not just to meet regulations, but to future-proof your business and build investor and consumer trust. Related to this, use other tools, guidance, and case studies that have been developed by stakeholders to help build your business case. We're actually about to publish a discussion paper drawing on 5 years of performance data from over 1,000 companies, which draws a link between positive social performance and financial performance. These insights can help you make more informed and integrated decision-making, linking sustainability to wider business strategy, risk, and finance. Number 3, drive innovation and technology for impact. Australia can harness its strengths in clean energy, regenerative agriculture, and digital solutions to stay competitive. Of course, we know the world is rapidly turning to the wider APAC region, with countries like China and Singapore rapidly advancing solutions like green tech, EVs, and circular economy models. And finally, accelerate peer learning and collaboration across stakeholder groups. On the peer learning side, by attending company-focused peer learning sessions and events, this can help you work with your peers in closed-door settings to freely exchange ideas, challenges, etc. These are often free for companies to attend and convened by organisations such as BCSDA and WBA. Next slide, please, Nikki. Cool. And then our launch, which I know we briefly touched on before, but in January 2026, we will publish brand new assessments and rankings of all 2,000 companies that we assess across all of our benchmarks. This is a combination of 2 years of WBA research in the making, so it's very exciting. This will provide a crucial moment to comprehensively spotlight leadership, identify best practices, reveal the urgent gaps that need to be addressed, and highlight the priorities for building a sustainable and stable future. As part of this, we will also be measuring readiness of companies' transition plans. To support this launch, we will convene a CEO-focused launch event at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in January. And after that, we will also be convening regional launches in Montreal and Australia. And then throughout the year, we will be planning a number of company peer learnings and smaller events where we can delve deeper into the findings throughout the year. Cool, that's my part done. Over back to you, Nikki, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so just 2 slides left, and then we'll just hand it over for any Q&A. Thanks very much, Kendra. So you've had a bit of a deep dive there into Australia, the performance of companies, but also the action that we see is possible, and I'm sure that many here are already getting involved in. Just to wrap up, to say that, as I said earlier, but the idea is not to have benchmarks for the sake of having data. It's very much about driving action, finding ways and tools that can fill the gaps and that can prioritize. And a particular area where we're seeing priority needed is in transition planning. So maybe we can come back to that. But I think a key thing to say here is that it's also a whole of society and whole of ecosystem approach. There's a role to play, obviously, for business, and we think that business shouldn't be having to wait for regulation, but we understand at the same time the importance of regulation and how that ensures that if you don't have the regulation, then you can have leaders, companies taking risks, stepping forward, driving action, and then the laggards are not being ultimately the cost is not being priced in appropriately. So we do think it's important to both have investor action, business action, as well as the government regulation around that. So it's, as I say, a whole of society, whole of ecosystem approach that's needed. But also, and Kendra briefly mentioned there, that in Davos, we'll be launching our 2000 company assessment. So having gone through the whole benchmarking cycle over the last few years at WBA, this year we're reassessing all 2000 companies. And a key target audience for us in our January launch in Davos in particular will be around working with CEOs and boards. We know that tone for the top and that your leadership is really key within this action. So one final slide to say, of course, there's lots more that you can get involved with or just stay informed. You can sign up here. As I say, we'll share the slides. We have a newsletter which keeps everybody up to date. There's lots of interesting updates and activities on LinkedIn, including what we're calling the 2000 Reasons campaign, which is live. That 2000 company assessment may mean that some organizations probably on the line are part of the assessment, so you may already be interacting with our research team. If you're not, then keep an eye out for the company assessment that will be coming your way, or you may already have someone within the organization who's received it. And we are in that final stretch. So we're now obviously November with a January launch. We're in the final stretch of finalizing those assessments. And obviously then hope that everyone can use that as a new tool as we move into the new year. So I'm going to pause there. Maybe I'll stop sharing my slides and open it up if we have some questions, or maybe Andrew wanted to follow up and dig into anything.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Kendra. That was a really good teaser and taster for what's coming down the line. I guess the first question, without notice, because we discussed the question that I was going to ask, but the first question without notice is when was this benchmarking done? Was it done in the last 3 months? Was it done in the last 6 months? Because obviously the world has changed somewhat and there is uncertainty and certain timidity and prevarication, I guess, is probably the word of the moment for business around what to do, because there are signals from a global political level and also now a national one in Australia. So I'd be interested to understand, when was that snapshot taken of those that business response?
Yeah, so the current assessments that we're showing have been done over the last few years, so varying timings, let's say. So I can have a quick look at the exact when was the last assessment on each, but the World Benchmarking Alliance, we're not that old, so we were launched in 2018. So the key assessments that have been going on mainly since 2021. So we've got back data for some of the assessments that we have, for instance, the nature benchmark and the food and agriculture benchmark that Kendra was showing. We've got a number of years of evidence on those benchmarks, but the current assessment is the key one. Let's say that performance data that we showed kind of gives a signal of the last few years. It doesn't yet give that reflection of what you're referring to now, Andrew, of like with this year, this has been a game changer year. And not in a good way to say, in the space that we work in. And so this year, when we are assessing all 2,000 companies and then have that January results, I think that will be the real powerful signal of where is business and what approach are business taking. And a lot of the signals that I've been getting interacting with companies around the world this year has been that a lot of the kind of glossy reporting, big launch events, big commitments have been toned down, dialed back. So I'd be interested to hear your view on that, Andrew, and in the local context that you're talking about. But that's what I'm seeing in the UK or the US and other places, and even Nairobi and other places that I've been this year. But underneath that, the core substance of reporting and the core indicators that we are looking at, that we do see as really transformative, but business also see as critical risk and opportunity indicators. So decision useful information is still being reported. So that's the current signal that we're getting in early indication of the assessments that we're doing. As I say, we'll get that full picture and really be able to see whether that's the case or whether there has been a pullback or even a pullback in just reporting in January.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to answer your question about the Australian circumstance, two comments. Australian companies have not always been as eager to pledge loudly and widely as perhaps other companies in other jurisdictions have done so. So it'll be interesting to see how the movement from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting is then communicated, because that will obviously be very important, not just from a broader company or real economy perspective, but also what the investor community in Australia does with that kind of information as well. But you're absolutely right around this movement from, I think it's been called by WBCSD, from pledge to performance. So this notion of the glossy is now moved to the hardcore, and this is the difficult period because it now is very much an accountability exercise for the information that you're then providing. And so that was my question, my pre-prepared question to both of you, which was, in this transition, what do you think at the moment that you're seeing the boards should be getting to understand? Because we hear a lot about the C-suite, and it's the CSO's responsibility, and the CEO and the CFO now has this new form of responsibility because of climate risk reporting. But what are you seeing at least in the chicken entrails of the data that you're getting, should boards be thinking about? Because that's, at least historically in Australia, been where arguably laggards exist.
Yeah, good, important question. Yeah, so I think that the things that we're starting to see is that why boards are getting more interested, or should be, but I would say are rather than just should. It's where these things are becoming more of a material risk. And there are different reasons why. And Kendra mentioned that in a few weeks' time we'll publish a discussion paper tentatively looking at that kind of link between social performance and some financial angle. And of course, there's always so much to debate around that kind of analysis, but it's pushing towards a view that boards need to look at this because it is becoming financially material. And then what I would say to flip that of, then you can't focus on everything and be doing everything all at the same time. Obviously, boards are one level removed from the day-to-day management of the company. But the key area was around focus to prioritize is around transition planning. And I think that is moving quickly in the climate space, the climate transition planning. We obviously have COP starting in the next few days. We've got some of the WBA team out there, and we'll be launching a report there, which is a first indication of how the 2,000 companies are doing on transition planning. And why transition planning is important, because it's very much what you were just saying, Andrew. It's moving from commitment to actual planning, robust investment indicators like the CapEx investment, indicators around what's your approach to climate policy, linking executive pay, for instance, to climate performance. So real concrete, substantial indicators, which are part of what we assess on a transition plan. So short term, I'd say it's boards looking at climate transition plan. What we're actually seeing in terms of stretch of the next few years is what we call an integrated transition plan. So at the right moment, connecting the nature, the climate, and the social side together and having that in a more holistic way. And I think that's something might feel overwhelming at the moment to bring all of that together, but that high level is then what is kind of decision useful for a board. So yeah, so much more we can cover there, but I know we're just looking at the clock and
that's right. Well, we called them a sprint for a reason. And apologies, Kendra, we didn't have time to hear your thoughts as well, but we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much to both Nikki and to Kendra for sharing the WBA's latest thinking. And for those who could join us live, don't forget that the recording of this will be uploaded to the BCSDA YouTube channel and then circulated in ESG Snapshot on Monday morning at 9 o'clock and via the member newsletter Insider also during that day, along with the related resources and links that you've seen in the presentation today. Also, don't miss out on the final sprint in this series, which is equity or people issues or social impact, accelerating social performance through benchmarking, which is on Tuesday, the 18th of November at 5:30 p.m, also Australian Eastern Summer Time. And you can register now via our website. So thank you, everybody, for joining. And we look forward to seeing you on the 18th. And most importantly, look forward to seeing you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.